We're going to be in Exodus chapter 18 today. Go ahead and get your Bible open to Exodus chapter 18, and we're actually going to be in a second passage today as well, Numbers 11. Exodus 18 and Numbers 11 today. I invite you to get that ready. We're continuing our series through the book of Exodus. We're making good progress this week. We are continuing to examine the story of the Israelites as they're making their way through the wilderness, and God is turning them from what the Apostle Peter described as not a people to becoming the people of God. We're learning to see our own story in a similar fashion, that God is turning us not just into people that are like Christ, but a community that's being formed into the people of God, a people after Christ. And so we're continuing to learn what there is to learn from their story and how it impacts our story today. Before we get started, question for you. Have you ever felt like you were in over your head? Life was too much. You had a hard time even just seeing the way forward. I mean, it was that tough, that difficult. That's where Moses is today as we pick up. The passage that we're going to read from Exodus is probably a little bit more widely familiar to many of you. It's the story where Jethro, the father-in-law, comes and has a little talk with Moses about how things are going. The Numbers 11 passage is another story. You'll see how these things pair well together. You're going to see Moses in a little bit more desperate situation. So let's see what the Lord has for us this morning. Starting in Exodus 18. We're going to pick it up in verse 13 this morning. The next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people. And they stood around him from morning till evening. And when his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered him, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions." Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions, and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied." Sounds like wise advice. Let's jump over to Numbers 11 and read another passage that I think is going to be insightful. Numbers 11, picking up in verse 10. This goes back to when the people were complaining and asking for meat. Where's that quail? Moses heard the people of every family wailing at the entrance to their tents. The Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. He asked the Lord, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give us meat to eat.' I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you are going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. If I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin." The Lord said to Moses, "Bring me 70 of Israel's elders who are known to you as leaders and officials among the people. Have them come to the tent of meeting, that they may stand there with you. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take some of the power of the Spirit that is on you and put it on them. They will share the burden of the people with you, so that you will not have to carry it alone." Jump down to verse 24, please. So Moses went out and told the people what the Lord had said. He brought together 70 of their elders and had them stand around the tent. And then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke with them, and he took some of the power of the Spirit that was on him and put it on the 70 elders. And when the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied, but they did not do so again. However, 2 men, whose names were Eldad and Medad, had remained in the camp. They were listed among the elders, but did not go out to the tent. Yet the Spirit also rested on them, and they prophesied in the camp. A young man ran and told Moses, "Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp." Joshua, son of Nun, who had been Moses' aide since youth, spoke up and said, "Moses, my Lord, stop them." But Moses replied, "Are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit on them." Then Moses and the elders of Israel returned to the camp. I trust you can see why I brought those passages together this morning. There's some parallels going on in those stories, even though they take place at different times in the life of the community. There's a heavy load that's being borne by one man, Moses, and he feels overwhelmed. And you might read it hyperbolically when Moses says to the Lord, if I'm pleasing to you, kill me. But I don't want to rush over that this morning, because it's very easy for us to feel overwhelmed to the point where we might not feel like life's worth living. In fact, I bet we could go around the room. You could name people that have felt that way at times, if you yourself haven't felt that way at times to varying degrees. And it works like this. There's a burden that we all have to carry. And sometimes that burden feels so heavy that we get to a place of desperation. I don't know how to carry this thing anymore. And that place of desperation, if it's not resolved, can lead us to a place of despair. There is no solution. This is a hopeless situation. I'm stuck. And we need a way out. And so we're not going to spend our whole time diving into this topic, but I thought we would be remiss to not just take a moment to talk about what do you do when you get to that place that Moses very well may be in the Numbers passage today, wondering if life is worth living because it's so hard. And I want to take special note of what Moses did in that situation. What does he do when he gets to that hopeless place? He goes to God. Right? It's so easy to want to pull away when things seem so heavy and nobody seems to be able to help you with it, and you feel like you've got to do this on your own and you can't. It's easy to want to just pull away from everyone. But Moses leans in. He turns to the Lord. Why? Because he knows that the Lord is powerful, and he knows that the Lord is good, and he knows the Lord is on his side. And so he turns to the Lord. God has the power to turn hopeless into hope-filled, to give peace in place of despair. And so Moses goes to God. God is the author of life. Right? So if he's wondering about whether or not to keep going, it only makes sense that you would go to the author of life to have a conversation about that. And friends, if God is the author of life, guess what? That means whether or not our life keeps going is actually his choice, not our choice. Let's not take that choice away from God. That's his choice. And friends, God gives such a compelling, perfect answer to the problem that Moses has, that we sometimes have when the burden feels too heavy to keep going. God tells Moses, here's what we're going to do. Share the burden. Share the burden. When you don't feel like you can do it anymore, you need to not withdraw, but to lean in, to share with God and to share with others. God's going to show Moses how to do that in our story today. I didn't want to go past that compelling part of the story. Again, it might have been a hyperbolic moment. Moses is exaggerating, or he might have been deadly serious. And we all can get to that point at times. So, friends, if you have ever dealt with suicidal thoughts, or you know other people that have dealt with suicidal thoughts, first of all, take them seriously. And then try to get them to go to God. Come with them to God. Help them to share the burden. Be a part of the solution. And provide them with resources. Okay, whether that might just be somebody that they can talk to that can understand their burden. We all need people to come alongside us when things feel hopeless. And so if you're looking for more resources to come alongside people, please don't hesitate to talk to me. Somebody on our staff, we'd be happy to connect you if that's something that you would need help with. Okay, that was a heavy moment, but this topic is really for all of us. Some of us haven't reached that moment of desperation, but we all have a burden to carry, and what ought we to do with it? And the answer for all of us is to share the burden. That is the answer. And so I'm breaking down our passage today in a way to help us figure out how do we do that? How do we come alongside each other? Step number one is we got to acknowledge the burden. We have to admit that there is one to begin with. And for some of us, that's really difficult to do, to admit that we have this inability to carry it alone, or at least an inability to carry it healthily alone, right? Sometimes we just keep bearing it and we keep getting less and less healthy, but I got this. Wouldn't you be better off if you shared the burden? First of all, you have to admit that you have one. Genesis 2:18, from the very beginning, God creates man, and then he says, it's not good for what? Man to be alone, right? Of course, we use this passage a lot at weddings to talk about how God is bringing man and woman together, but there's also a lesson to be learned about how humanity as individuals, we're not meant to do life alone. We're meant to share it in community with each other. It's not good for us to be alone. Interestingly, this is before the fall, right? God creates us perfectly insufficient. Perfectly insufficient. Have you ever thought about that? It's kind of like a lock and key situation, right? I'm not saying a person and a person are a lock and key, but I'm saying when you think about insufficiency being perfect, a lock needs a key, but if the lock doesn't have a key, is the lock imperfect? No. The lock can still be perfect even though it needs a key to fully function. Does that make sense? Just because something is insufficient doesn't mean it's imperfect. God created us insufficient by design. in his perfect design. He wants us to have people. He wants us to have community. He doesn't want us to do life alone. There's nothing imperfect about being insufficient. Have you ever thought about that? So, acknowledging the burden. First of all, we have to bring it to God, just like Moses did. Jesus tells us this in Matthew 11, 28 through 30. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you what? Rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus wants to exchange our burden for another burden. And that all of a sudden sounds like, well, that's not so great. I already have a burden. Why would I want a different one? His burden's different. His burden is easy and light. And guess what? He puts a yoke on us. Remember what a yoke is? Ties you to another animal, like an oxen, right? And the two carry it together. We don't have to carry it alone. And guess who does the heavy lifting? Jesus does the heavy lifting. And so we get to partner with him as he does the heavy work, and we get to come alongside and learn from him. That's a much better burden to carry. So first, we have to acknowledge the burden and bring it before God. Secondly, we have to bring it before others. Galatians 6:2 says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. This is how we do life together. It's carrying each other's burdens, sharing one another's burdens. That's how we are to do life together as the body of Christ. Did you know that? How are you doing it? Sharing each other's burdens. But here's the question. Why is it oftentimes easier to tell God these things than it is to tell people? God who is perfect, God who is our judge, we feel free to tell him how things are too hard, and sometimes we ramble on and we complain to him about how things are difficult. But then when somebody else asks us how it's going, oh, it's fine. What? You're going to complain to the God of the universe, but you're going to tell everybody else that things are cool. There's something wrong there. We all have a burden to carry. Why are we so afraid to tell each other that things are too difficult to do alone? There's a problem there. And it's because there's a trade-off, isn't there? And that's the second part of what it means to share the burdens. That we have to acknowledge there's actually a couple of trade-offs that we're making when we admit that there's a burden. The first one is I would like to call sharing weakness. We don't like to share our weakness with other people because why? The perception of us changes, doesn't it? Right? If I look like I have it all together, what do I at least think that you think about me? Oh, he's great. He's good. He's strong. He's capable. Right? That's what I'm hoping your perception of me is. But when I show signs of weakness, oh, I guess John can't do all that I thought he could do. Oh, at least that's what I'm thinking you're thinking of me, right? Am I the only one that thinks this way? Okay. All right. So why do we hide? We want people to think highly of us. But you know what everybody else is thinking when we finally admit that we can't hold it all together? They really are human. They're just like me. Yay. Here's what Romans 12, 3-5 says. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. Part of the reason we want others to have a misperception of us, we want them to think highly of us because that's how highly we think of ourselves sometimes. Sometimes in our arrogance, we want other people to see us the same way that we see ourselves, or at least we try to see ourselves as we deceive ourselves. So that's one reason that we don't share our weaknesses with other people. The problem is when we have an inflated sense of self, that it makes the body kind of lopsided and dysfunctional. Think about, have you ever seen somebody who just, they love to go to the gym and they love to only work out like their legs or their biceps or something like that. And after a while, if they're regularly working out that specific part of the body, it kind of looks a little funny, doesn't it? Because they're super ripped in one part of their body, but the rest of it's not so much. It looks a little lopsided. It looks a little funny. That's kind of how it is in the body of Christ when we get a little bit inflated over here and just kind of normal over here. It doesn't look right. It doesn't function the way that it ought to. We're supposed to be interconnected. We're supposed to be belonging to one another. The other reason that we hide ourselves from other people when we want them to have an incorrect and I misspoke. The other reason that we hide from each other is because that we, while some of us want others to think highly of us, the other reason is because we don't think very highly of ourselves. You know what I mean? Like, my burden doesn't really matter. Like, people, they shouldn't really care. They don't care, or they shouldn't really care about my issues. That my issues are they don't matter. They're inconsequential. I don't think very highly of myself and what I'm going through, and so I hide myself. But Matthew 10:29 reminds us, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows." What's the author saying there? Just because the sparrows are sold for a couple sparrows are sold for a penny doesn't mean that they don't have high value in God's eyes, who is the creator. And if the sparrows, God cares for them individually, how much more does he care for you? Because you're worth more than many sparrows. That's not to say that our value is less because we're just as much as many sparrows. Actually, the author is saying we have high value because we're worth as much as many sparrows in the eyes of the Lord. In fact, all the hairs of your heads are numbered. I don't have any, so all the hairs of my beard are numbered. There, how's that? So, I mentioned that there's 2 trade-offs, okay? The first trade-off is that people's perception of us has to change when we acknowledge the burden that we have to share. The second trade-off that we make when we acknowledge the burden is this: we have to share power. When we acknowledge a burden for the sake of sharing that burden with other people, just like Moses does here, guess what? That means that we have to share the power that comes along with the responsibilities that God has entrusted to us. Because we're empowering other people to get involved, right? That's what Moses is doing here. He's saying, I can't do this myself. God says, fine, let's bring in some other guys to help. Jethro suggests, let's bring in some other guys to help. And that means that Moses doesn't get to do it all, which is a relief, and Moses doesn't get all the credit. Right? You with me? You see what I'm saying? So there's another trade-off, especially when we're in positions of responsibility and authority, and we have some level of power that's involved with what the burden that we're to carry. We now have to share it, which also means sharing the glory. And for Moses, it literally means sharing God's spirit or God's power with these other people. And now, guess what? They're getting some of the attention from the community as they start to get involved with these kinds of things. And some of the spirit that was on Moses, I wonder what that was like. That some of the Spirit of God that was in him is now being taken from him and given to these other guys. Does that feel like a sense of loss? Sure it does. So there's another trade-off that's happening there when we allow others to share the burden. And I love that this kid comes running and tells him that Eldad and Medad have started prophesying in the camp, and Joshua gets all risen up about it. And he's like, Moses, we got to stop these guys. And I love Moses' response. Are you jealous for my sake? I wish everybody would start prophesying. I wish just the Spirit of God would just pour out. The power of God would just be on all of his people. I don't need to keep it to myself. But friends, we do get jealous sometimes, don't we? We kind of want the glory and the credit sometimes. There's a trade-off that we have to make. So are we going to be jealous as we share the burden and the power and the opportunity with people? Or are we going to celebrate that God provided and that God's working through other people? There's two types of jealousy, right? When someone supplants my relationship with another person, that's one form of jealousy. Okay, when someone supplants my relationship with another person. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a healthy thing, sometimes it's really not. Okay? But there's another type of jealousy when someone has a relationship with someone that I want. Guess what that's called? Coveting. That's always bad. Two types of jealousy. Sometimes jealousy can be good. We see God is jealous for his people, especially when they're in idolatry, right? Jealousy can be a good thing, but more often than not, it's not a good thing. But Moses is neither. He's happy because his burden is lightened and he has help. Here's the thing, though. In these kinds of situations, what we're jealous about is not really ours anyway. Think about it. If Moses was to be jealous that the Spirit of God is now at work through other people, wait, whose spirit was it? It's God's Spirit. It's not his spirit. He didn't have any ownership over the Spirit of God in his life. It's God's to begin with. So Moses doesn't really have any right to be jealous about God working through other people. He doesn't really have any right to be jealous about the Spirit of God being taken from him. It wasn't his anyway. And guess what? That's not just true of the Spirit of God, right? That's true of any gift that God gives us. If he wants to take that, give it to somebody else, I don't have the right to be jealous about that. That wasn't mine to begin with, right? But we have to be anticipating as we share the burden and opportunity with other people, there are a couple of trade-offs that happen. These are helpful to know if we're going to live that kind of life. So, we've talked about admitting the burden. We've talked about the trade-off that happens. Now we want to talk about the ways in which, or I should say, the types of people with which we share the burden with. And we see them exemplified in our story today and the story we've been looking at over these several weeks and months. The first one that we see in our story today is the mentor. Jethro is the mentor in our story today, the father-in-law. He's sharing the burden with Jethro in the sense that Jethro has the opportunity to come in and help him figure out kind of the logistics of how is this all going to be distributed? How are we going to actually make this work out, right? And so even though Jethro isn't one of those people that literally takes on the burden for Moses, he helps him figure out strategically how to go about that. And so the question that relates to a mentor sharing the burden that we're kind of turning the corner now. How does this relate to us? Is this: are there people in your life that have permission to speak into your life? Do you have those kinds of people in your life, mentor-type people that have permission to speak into your life? Do you have those kind of people around you? And if maybe you have those people around you, but have you given them permission to speak into your life? Because guess what? Most mentor-type folks, they're not just going to tell you. They've lived long enough to know that that's probably not a good idea. It probably won't be well received anyway. They're waiting for permission to speak into your life. Have you given them permission to do that? One of the other examples now from the New Testament is Paul's letters to Timothy, right? Letters of 1st and 2nd Timothy are a letter from Paul, mentor, to mentee Timothy, right? And in fact, Paul and Timothy have such a strong relationship that Paul considers himself a spiritual father to Timothy. That's the closeness of their relationship. So that's the first kind of relationship with which we share the burden with. The second one that I want to highlight today is that of the peer relationship. Think Moses and Aaron, right? These guys are peers. They have slightly different roles that they're playing, but they're essentially peers in the journey that they're walking together. And so the essential question around this kind of person in your life is, are there people in your life with whom you simply share the burden? Okay? Jethro wasn't the person with whom Moses shared the burden. He was the person who he had permission to speak into his life, and he kind of talked to him about how that might look. But Aaron is literally one of those kinds of people with whom Moses shares the burden, right? And Aaron is just one of many, right? Now we see in the story today, God bringing 70 elders, Jethro suggesting to him to point out leaders of thousands and hundreds and 50s and 10s. Those are peer relationships. That doesn't mean that they're the same place on the hierarchy of leadership, right? But it means that they're the people with whom we share the burden. Think of David and Jonathan from the book of 1 Samuel, right? Where they have such a relationship where they care about each other to the point where they are willing to sacrifice for each other for the sake of building one another up, right? The third relationship of the three that I want to talk about today, I already hinted at this one, is the mentee relationship. Think of Joshua, right? Moses has Joshua in his life. He's been an aide to Moses since his youth, basically since he showed up in Egypt, it looks like. So the question to ask this morning is, are there people in your life that would benefit from your experience? Do you have people in your life like that benefit from your experience? Think of Barnabas and John Mark, if you know those folks from the New Testament, from the book of Acts, right? Barnabas was partnered with the Apostle Paul. Remember, they did their missionary journeys together, the first missionary journey together, and Barnabas was a great partner to Paul. They also brought along John Mark, this young guy, who, after they hit some challenges, John Mark took off and went home. Got too hard for whatever reason. We don't know the details. Well, sometime later, Paul and Barnabas are ready to go out again on missionary journeys. Barnabas wants to give John Mark another chance. Remember this? What's Paul say? No, I'm not going to bring that guy. He abandoned us last time, right? And they get in such a dispute about it that Paul and Barnabas end up splitting ways, and Paul and Silas go off together, and Barnabas and John Mark go a different direction. God uses both of them to do his work in different places. God actually uses it when they go different directions. But Barnabas is that mentor figure to John Mark. John Mark is kind of that mentee. Barnabas is coming alongside. He's helping build him up, equip him for the work, giving him more and more chances to try and figure things out, not giving up on him. And it reminds me of 2 Timothy 2:2, which says, "And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." This is Paul's words to Timothy. Paul is mentoring Timothy in the faith, but also in ministry. And he says, I've invested in you. Now you need to find reliable people to pour into that they might take over the work. Because guess what? One day Paul's going to be out of the picture, and Timothy's going to be in charge, and he's going to need people to work with and for him. But then guess what? One day Timothy's going to be out of the picture, They need to be investing in the next generation so that the next generation is ready to pick up the torch. Right? It's kind of like this thing over here. We make disciples who make disciples, right? We're investing in other people, keeping in mind that they are investing in the next person, right? So, when you think about sharing the burden, it's easy to see how the mentor helps us figure out how to share that burden. It's easy to think about peers and how they help share the burden. How do mentees help carry or share the burden? And here's the thing. For a mentee who's figuring it out, guess what they need as much as anything else? They need opportunity. And so you're giving them opportunity to learn how to share the burden. And they may not carry as much as a peer can carry right now, but you're teaching them how to carry the load. So you're giving them opportunity even as they're helping you. And friends, sometimes here's the thing. Even if they're not directly helping with whatever your specific burden is, however you would name that, sharing your life will lighten the burden because it reminds you of all the early lessons and struggles you had and you have lost touch with. And there's something about getting in touch with where you were at that stage of the game that does some lightening in you. That makes things a little less heavy. Those of you that have done this kind of thing before, I see you nodding out there. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so a word to potential mentees out there. If you're thinking to yourself, gosh, I could use a mentor, here's some things for you to keep in mind. Joshua, we learned last week, who was Moses' aide for all these years, he went from aide to army general in that one story. Remember? He got this huge promotion from kind of being Moses' right-hand man to now he's organizing and leading an army against the Amalekite people. So how is Joshua ready for that? Was he ready for that? Moses obviously knew he could just turn to Joshua and say, this is what we got to do. I'll be up there. Okay, we're good. Moses knew he was ready. Did Joshua know he was ready? Here's how you can be ready for the next step, whatever God's calling you to next. First of all, be faithful. Be faithful. Be consistent. Show up regularly. Be reliable in the places that God has called you to be. Secondly, be a learner. Don't just show up and think that you know all that you need to know or that God's going to show you what you need to know along the way. Certainly, He will show you very much. But we also need to take initiative, be proactive to gain knowledge and insight and skills to do better at what God's called us to do. That's called being a good steward, is taking responsibility for what I have to do and figuring out how to do what I do better and not just waiting for it to hit me. Be a learner. Thirdly, anticipate the needs around you, especially those of the leaders and mentors around you. Anticipate what the needs are and figure out how you can meet them. Nothing delights a mentor or a leader better than when you've anticipated a need and you've met it before they've even asked. That's huge. And that indicates to them that you know how to look at what's going on and that you're ready for more. Fourthly, set an example in your walk with God. Set an example. That's one thing that Paul exhorts Timothy to, right? Be an example in your faith. Don't let them look down on you because you were young. Guess what else that means? Don't look down on yourself because you're young. Don't let your youth be an excuse that you're not doing what you could be doing or maybe ought to be doing. Don't let youth be your excuse for not taking that next step. Set an example in your walk with God first and foremost. Nothing is perhaps more exciting for leaders and mentors than when we see young people taking their faith seriously and seeing spiritual maturity blossom in young people. It's inspiring to us. Next, have courage. Be willing to do hard things. Don't be afraid of doing something you haven't done before. That was God's words to Joshua as he took over, right? Be strong and courageous. And then lastly, be willing to make mistakes and own up to them. Be willing to make, if we're going to grow, we have to do things wrong before we can do them right. Right? That's what practice is for. Practice assumes we're going to get it wrong and that we're going to learn to do it right over time. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, but also own up to them along the way. That's how you grow. That's how mentors know how to invest in you so that you can grow with their help. That's just a quick word to some mentees out there. Here's our conclusion. What have we been talking about today? How does this relate to formation? What does this have to do with why we're here today? Guess what? Guess what we've been talking about today? Church. We've been talking about church today. It's a place for people who have cast our ultimate burden on Jesus. Right? Christ followers, that's one way to define ourselves. We're people that have decided the burden was too much. We knew Jesus was the only one who could carry it, and we've cast it upon him with his permission. We're also a network of relationships to help share each other's burdens. All right? Jesus carries our ultimate burden, but we are also to carry one another's burdens. We already read it, Galatians 6:2. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If we want to be Christ followers, if we want to do what Christ calls us to do, there it is, carry each other's burdens. We also have a mission. The church is a people, but we also have a mission, which is to reach lost people with burdens that are too heavy for them to carry. Okay? That's what we're to be about. It's all about how do we deal with this burden in the ultimate sense, but also these smaller ones, not less significant, but smaller ones that we are to carry. We got to do it together. So just some words of advice as we do this. Don't wait to receive help. Maybe you're sitting here today and you've been thinking this whole time, I know what you're talking about, John. I've had this burden forever and nobody's helping me with it. Don't wait around to receive help. Start caring for others. And guess what? As you start to develop relationship with people that's deepened by you getting involved with them, that's the context where you're building trust and vulnerability, where you can begin to acknowledge your burdens because you know that you can share with them because they've shared with you. You can begin to pray for each other. But here's what the common trait is of a lot of folks who are waiting around to be helped. They don't tell anybody that they're needing help. They just assume that we're going to figure it out. It's not going to happen, guys. We have to be forthcoming with each other, acknowledging our need for help. We all need it, but we all have to take the time to admit it to trustworthy people around us. Don't wait for it to come to you. You need to find trusting relationships with whom you can share. Next, if you don't have these types of relationships, meaning the mentor, the peer, the mentee, if you don't have those types of relationships, friends, I'm just going to tell you, you need to engage more deeply around here. If you don't have these relationships already, you're kind of skimming the surface of what this whole church thing is about. You are missing out if you're not engaging with these types of relationships around this place. I can't do it for you. Nobody here can do it for you. You have to make a choice to get more involved, to share your burdens, and start helping carry others. Also, if you do have these kinds of relationships in the church, don't just assume that others have that figured out too. All right? So this is your chance to help them. Okay? That's part of carrying the burden, is helping others realize they have one and how they might get those things shared with one another. Okay? Here's the thing. Spiritual maturity means that you do both of these things well. that you admit your need for help and you're willing and available to help. You have to do both. Okay, some of us are really good at helping other people. I love to help carry other people's burdens. I'm service-oriented people. We all know people like that in this place who love to help other people but are not willing to open up about their own need. Conversely, we also know other people who are really good about sharing how life is tough and they just need, but there's no output. There's no caring and sharing of other people's burdens. Spiritual maturity lets you can do both well. You with me? Here's the reflection for today. Do you have the 3 types of relationships we looked at today? Which ones are missing? Notice I said ones. I'm assuming that for some of us, we might be missing all 3. We're just kind of floating along the surface of what it means to be a part of church here. Okay, do you have the 3 types of relationships we looked at today? Which ones are missing? Ask this question of yourself. Ask this question of God. Why is that? Why? And who might take those roles? Just begin to start chewing on that. Are you getting to know people enough around here that you might be willing to take a risk? Might be willing to be a little bit vulnerable. Sharing of yourself. Asking about how they're doing, what burdens they're carrying. Here's the step. Ask just one of these people if they would be interested in getting together sometime and get it on the calendar. Don't just ask them generally, hey, we should get together sometime. We all know what that means. It means that's a nice thought, and if you're serious, let me know when you want to actually get it on the calendar. Okay? Get it on the calendar. Start investing in the relationship according to the type of relationship you intend for it to be. Watch how they respond to determine if it might be a good fit to continue. Don't say right up front, hey, I think I should be your mentor, and let's dive in. That's too intimidating. That's too much to bite off before you figured it out. Now, sometimes that works out when we know it's for a short duration and there's an out later. But if you can just begin to get to know each other without strings attached yet, see if it's going to be a good fit, and then maybe you can have the DTR later, right? The define the relationship. What is this actually going to be? Are we going to carry each other's burdens together? Or is this going to be a mentoring kind of relationship? You can figure that out later. Just start connecting first. Keep your expectations modest. Okay? A word for each of those 3 kinds of relationships. If you are looking for a mentor relationship, ask for advice or perspective about something. All right? If you want to see if this is going to be a good fit for somebody to be a mentor, just start asking them, what do you think about this? What's your perspective on this? To start to see what that kind of dynamic is like. If you're looking for a peer relationship where you're sharing one another's burdens, ask for prayer for something that's challenging you right now. That's all. It doesn't have to be more than that. Just start opening up about what your needs are and ask for prayer. Start there. Hey, maybe even take it the next step. Ask what they need prayer for, too. Take it both ways. And if you are looking for a mentee in your life, here's a great place to start. Just ask lots of questions to give them the opportunity to be known. When they see that you care about their life, that you're curious about their life, they're going to start to open up. They're going to start to share. And they're going to start to share more deeply over time as trust builds. Just start asking questions. And here's the thing about mentoring relationships. They're going to be lopsided. Don't anticipate that they're going to be perfectly reciprocal kinds of relationships. If you're a mentor, you're really in the relationship for them, not expecting a whole lot in return. Okay? So that's just the nature, that's just the dynamic of a mentor-mentee relationship. It's going to be a little lopsided. That's okay. All right, a lot to chew on today. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. God, for some of us today, maybe these burdens that we carry feel really overwhelming. Lord, I pray that we would all develop the capacity to reach out for help. May it start with you, our great capital H helper. God, you are so good. You are so giving. You are so kind. And you have carried the ultimate burden for us. You've taken our sin to the cross. Thank you, Lord, that we might be saved, that we might be redeemed, that we might be restored, that we might have the promise of eternity with you. Thank you for taking that burden to the cross. God, with all of the lesser burdens that are still a big deal, would you help us to share with each other? Jesus, would you show us what it means to come under your yoke? That burden might be easy and light. We thank you that as we carry and share one another's burdens, that they feel lighter to us, they feel lighter to the ones that we're sharing with. And somehow, Lord, I think supernaturally you make it lighter through your Spirit as well. God, help us to be the church. Help us to think about these types of relationships and where you're calling us to invest and to be cared for. In Jesus' name, amen.